This is the Aston Martin Lagonda, and where else but DT Rockstar 1.
I'm Richard Vaughn, and this is my 1984 Aston Martin Lagonda. It's a pretty rare car. Most people have never seen one. When Aston Martin was having financial troubles in the 1970s, they developed a car that they wanted to grab everyone's attention and announce to the world that they were still in business and they were at the top of their game and they were the most desirable car in the world. So to defy convention, they came up with this. It was the first car to use electronic controls for the engine management. It was the first car to have digital instrumentation. It was the first car to have screens. It was the first car to have capacitive membrane touch switches. Mostly they work, which is kind of fun. The designer of the car is a guy named William Townes, and he was involved in what was called the folded paper school of styling. And as you can see, everything about this car is a wedge. It's very folded. It's very compact, it's incredibly long, but it's only the same height as a Porsche 911. So you have this incredible luxury car, and it goes on and on and on in terms of length. It's fairly dramatic looking. And it worked. They had the show car in 1976, and the public was wowed. They were just blown away by this car. Of course, it wasn't really a functional car that they showed, so the production version of the Lagonda didn't appear until 1979. U.S. sales for the Lagonda started in 1982. This is a 1984 car. They made 643 cars between 1979 and 1990. The last cars went out of production in the spring of 1990. This car is number 372. And it's kind of interesting because it's kind of in the middle of the production range, and there are a lot of changes that evolved over the years that make this car a little bit more user-friendly than some of the other cars. Things that's often read about Lagondas is that they were unreliable. And I think that it's important to keep in mind the state of automotive electronics in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I'm sure that if you were a 50-year-old automotive journalist in 1979, the electronic instrumentation and the capacitive membrane touch switches and all of the things that made the Lagonda so space-aged at that time, that all seemed very advanced and very scary. But probably today, your average third grader wouldn't be too impressed with the blinking LEDs and the capacitive touch switches. So the car has sort of an undeserved reputation for being complex and unreliable when it comes to the electronics. I don't really think that any of that's true. I use the car regularly, and I don't have any problems at all with it. One of the questions I get the most about the Lagonda is, how does it drive? What's it like to ride in? And it's an interesting question because with a car that costs $150,000 in 1984, you have to assume that it must be one of the best driving cars of the 80s. I happen to own some other 80s cars that were in this premium price bracket, so I have a frame of reference. I own a Silver Spur from Rolls-Royce and a T-Series from Bentley, so I have some experience and I can talk, with some authority about what they are like to drive and to own. This car has 280 brake horsepower, and it makes around 302, 303 pounds-feet of torque at 3,000 RPM. For an 80s car, it's extraordinarily fast. The handling, because of the low center of gravity, is exceptional. Compared to a Rolls-Royce of the era, it just goes around corners like it's on rails. The ride is superlative on the highway. It's extremely smooth and well composed. It has self-leveling at the rear. It never looks like it's off kilter, regardless of the situation, how many people are sitting in the back or how much luggage you have in it. It always drives great. It is not the most robustly engineered car in terms of the way it's put together. I think the Rolls-Royces of the era were probably a little bit further ahead in terms of the build quality and fit and finish, but those cars don't make you feel the way this car makes you feel. Now, I should mention, I'm a car designer. I live in Detroit, Michigan, and I studied design at the College for Creative Studies. And when I was in design school, in the early 90s, there was nothing more incredible to me than this car. And my design colleagues, my fellow students, we used to drive on the weekends to the dealership in Dearborn, Michigan called the Sports Car Exchange, where they sold these cars, and we would just press our heads against the glass and think, wow, isn't that amazing? Maybe one day. So in 2004, I was at a car show called Mad Dogs and Englishmen, and I saw this car, and I thought, that car looks amazing. I hope it doesn't have a red interior, because that's my favorite color. And if it has a red interior, I'll have to buy it. Sure enough, not only was this car for sale, but it's the only Lagonda in this color combination. Blue, the red interior, piped blue with red carpets. It's absolutely spectacular to look at. And it's been a dream come true for me. From a design point of view, the Lagonda is so striking because they employed techniques that can only be done when you make a car by hand. This is not a mass-produced car. And for those who aren't familiar with how cars are actually made, it's a little bit of an education to sort of see why the Lagonda is special. So for example, this fender cannot be stamped. This could only be made by hand. You've got a crease here, a deep crease here, an extremely tight radius, a return on the other side, and more sheet metal that comes down beside the headlamp. That's something that can only be done in a handmade situation. And you'll notice that as the fender flows to the A-pillar, there's no break at all. It's a continuous piece of sheet metal from the front of the car, up the A-pillar, to the roof, down the C-pillar, and to the trunk lid. When you come around the rear of the car, you see even more of this sort of handmade craftsmanship. The incredibly tight radii that form the junction between the boot lid and the fender is something that you could only see on a handmade car. It would be impossible to stamp this. As you move around to the rear of the car, you'll notice that the license plate surround area is a deep inset. This cannot be stamped in a normal stamping die. It would never happen. It would be too deep. So this is all hand formed. And you'll also notice that the Lagonda was the first car in the world to have all of its taillights on the trunk lid, or the boot lid as we call it in British car speak. And that meant that in some markets there had to be another set of taillights inside the trunk, so that if you were driving with the lid open, there would still be a set of lights that wasn't facing the sky. US cars aren't equipped that way. But it's little things like this that really set the car apart as being a car of firsts. It's the car of the future that never arrived, but you get to experience it.